I'll never forget my first Holy Week as your pastor. It was Wednesday night of that week, and we had just celebrated a foot washing service at the Wednesday night worship, Space for Grace. After the service, a woman came up to me. I cannot remember who it was. She kindly asked when my children would be arriving for Easter weekend. What she couldn't have known when she asked me that question was that that year was the first year in my entire history of motherhood that my children would not be with me on Easter. Holy Week is the busiest work week for ministers, but over the course of our family's life, the kids had been with me through it all. Every year, they would sit quietly and color while I dragged them to special services. I would stay up late on Saturday night filling Easter baskets with eggs and candy. We'd all dress up in our new clothes on Sunday morning and take pictures. Good memories. But the kids had grown up, as kids do, and they were busy with school and activities far away, and I hadn't realized that that was going to be the first Holy Week without the kids. So when I was asked that very kind, well-meaning question, it felt like a punch in the gut. I tried not to cry, but as any of you who know me can attest, tears come easily for me. And despite my best effort, a tear leaked out of my right eye and ran down my face as I explained that the kids would not be coming home for Easter this year. The poor woman who asked me that question looked extremely uncomfortable, and as I wiped away the tears, she said to me, "I'm sorry, I need to leave. I don't feel comfortable seeing the pastor cry." Then she turned and ran out the door. Now, it may be true that I cry more than the average person, but in my estimation, there is a lot about being human in this world that merits a good cry. We come to worship today with the tragic events of last week weighing on our minds, a critically important election looming ahead, and the state of our country in deep distress. And on this first Sunday of November, as is our custom, we celebrate All Saints' Day, a liturgical holiday when we remember and give thanks for the lives of those who have gone before us, especially those we've lost to death this year. It wouldn't surprise me if today one or two of us shed a tear for the moment in which we live or for the people we have lost. And if a tear or two escapes today, well, that's just fine. Sometimes the pain of being human means the tears just won't stop. With all of these thoughts present with us today, it's curious to notice that crying, weeping features large in our lectionary text for today, especially with the story of the raising of Lazarus. This amazing biblical story only appears in the Gospel of John. And for a little background, we should know that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were dear, dear friends of Jesus. He stayed often in their home, going there for respite from the rough work of ministry. They were like his family, people who saw him for who he really was and who welcomed him with open arms. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were siblings, and they lived in the little village of Bethany, about 2 miles east of Jerusalem, near the Mount of Olives. To set the scene for this story, Jesus had been absent. He was on a road trip far away from Jerusalem and from Bethany, where most of his ministry took place. The family sent urgent word to Jesus to return because Lazarus had taken suddenly ill. The text doesn't tell us what Lazarus was sick with, but Jesus was several days' travel away, and even upon getting the message, he delayed his return. By the time he got to Bethany, Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days, and Mary and Martha were furious with Jesus. They couldn't understand why Jesus hadn't dropped everything and come when they called him. He'd been out all over the countryside healing people who were sick. Why couldn't he just come back to Bethany and heal his friend? Jesus tells them he came later so that they would believe, but that excuse wasn't enough to stop the tears. So Jesus asked, "Where have you laid him? Where have you buried him?" And the group brought Jesus to Lazarus' tomb. standing there in front of a scene of death, finality, loss, grief, Jesus suddenly feels the same feelings as Mary and Martha. And to describe the scene, John pens the shortest verse in our Bibles, John 11:35. Jesus wept. He couldn't help himself. Because remember, there are a lot of things in life to cry about, and Jesus, in his full humanity, was feeling the same things that we feel when we lose someone we love. The fragility of human life, the utter finality of death, the deep, deep loss that makes us feel hollow inside, wondering how we can possibly make sense of all the pain. Of course, Jesus knew that the power of God would soon be on display, but that didn't take away from his own grief. And in this moment, we see God recognizing our humanity, acknowledging the breaking of our hearts, standing with us when the tears won't stop. And then, into that most raw of human moments, the group standing around Lazarus' tomb feeling such pain gets a jolting reminder of God's omniscience and power when Jesus calls Lazarus out from the tomb. As an aside, I often wish there was more nuance in the biblical narratives because I think it would help so much to know, say, what the weather was like, or someone's tone of voice, or the facial expressions of the crowd. This moment in the text is a great example. Martha, sidelined by grief, gets stressed out when Jesus asked her to open the tomb because she's worried about the smell. A body who's been dead for 4 days cannot smell very good. And Martha was just so upset about it because she knows what we all know, that death is permanent, that it comes for every one of us, and that sometimes we can't stop the tears. Still, Jesus calls Lazarus out of his open grave, and out he walks, strips of burial cloth still wrapped around his body, once dead, but now alive. And in this scene, on the one hand, there is the deep grief of human loss, and on the other hand, God's insistence that love and life will always have the final word. On Friday night, a group of Riversiders had the distinct honor of worshiping with our friends at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, where Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum is senior rabbi and our friend Rabbi Mike Moskowitz works on the clergy team. It was deeply moving for us to be there with our neighbors, to be able to show up after a week when the tears kept falling in response to the pain of our world. On Friday night, Rabbi Kleinbaum talked about how important it is to stand with each other in these moments, to make sure that we remind each other that love always has the final word, and that each of us shines like a light when it feels like the night is descending and the morning will never come. We went to worship Friday night at the synagogue because we needed to do something in the face of hatred and violence that has now migrated from the unrelenting and evil rhetoric of the President of the United States and the resulting appalling silence of so many of our leaders to angry white men with guns yet again desecrating holy space, ending the lives of innocent people, and acting out in actions this hateful rhetoric that we keep hearing day in and day out. I was following the news as you were this week, and I read a story about the Jewish community in Pittsburgh that was profoundly meaningful to me. The story was about Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, one of the victims in the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. As part of the weekly Shabbat liturgy, people who are grieving the loss of a loved one stand for the recitation of the mourner's Kaddish, a prayer to remember the dead. It was the personal practice of Dr. Rabinowitz, however, to stand for that prayer every single week. When asked why he stood week in and week out, even when he was not in mourning, he would say it was because he had no children who would one day stand for him. So he stood for others who had no one to stand for them. When the mourner's Kaddish was read at Sunday's memorial celebrating his life, The 300 in attendance rose as one and stood and prayed in his memory. Everybody there stood with and for each other and for Jerry. One of the worshipers there, a friend of Dr. Rabinowitz and fellow member of the synagogue, said this: "Given this experience and the loss of Jerry, I can say from now on, I will always stand as he did, for him and for others who have no one to stand for them." I think at the end of the day, this must be our response. When the world is falling apart and our hearts are breaking and the tears won't stop, we need to show up and we need to stand up for each other so that we can remember that God will always have the final word. Today we mark All Saints' Day, and I'll remind you that the word saint appears in the New Testament only in plural form. In the Bible, there's no singling out of individuals to name some as more holy than others. We are all saints together, standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before us and let their lights illumine our path, standing with those who are with us right here and now, spurring each other on to good living, and standing strong with our individual lights to help mark the path of those who will come behind us. How can we shine our lights for those who come behind us? We stand up for each other, as Jerry Rabinowitz did for so many, and as the community in Pittsburgh did for Dr. Rabinowitz. And this week in particular, there is an especially tangible way that we can stand for each other. We will stand at the polls on November 6th and vote. As we make our decision about voting, we will vote for leaders who behave in a way that honors the memory of those who have gone before us, caring for the most vulnerable among us, modeling collegiality and kindness, working to make our country a better and more just place for everyone. Go to the polls and vote. When you do, you are standing up for those who cannot stand for themselves. We heard earlier in the service today from the end of Revelation, where John of Patmos prophesies that in the end, God, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, will wipe every tear from our eyes. Hear these words that follow from the very end of Revelation. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing fruit in each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore, and there will be no more night. They need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. Amen.